Hey there YouTube, I'm Ikitsu, this is Ikitsu Times, welcome to my channel, welcome to a little bit of Darktide. So, I'm going to be looking at the different weapons and the way that we should be looking at them. And we're starting off with Kantrael MG1A Infantry Lasgun. Bit of a mouthful, like all the guns in this game are, but let's take a look at this thing. Now, there are two things that I want to dismiss right away. The first one is that this is a bad gun. There are going to be plenty of people who started out the game loaded in as a veteran sharpshooter or maybe the psyker, and they started off with Kantrael MG1A Infantry Lasgun and thought that it sucked. And that one probably did suck because you do start off with the lowest stats possible on your starting gun. Now, if you haven't figured it out, this means that the ones that you get later are actually much stronger. This is the highest difficulty possible, and it still does pretty decent damage to these guys. So we're looking at a gun that's capable of dishing out much better damage than I think a lot of people think it's capable of doing. The next thing to note about this is that there are some people I've heard saying that this is an all-arounder, general-purpose kind of gun, and that isn't true. This is a gun for the veteran marksman to do things that the veteran marksman is supposed to do. If you take it on the psyker, you're trying to play a little bit more into the idea that you're also a veteran sharpshooter. You're trying to go for those long-distance headshot kills, and same thing if you're playing the zealot. Normally, neither of those classes really emphasizes those attributes, but you really want to be able to do that as the veteran sharpshooter. So if you're playing as the veteran sharpshooter, this is going to be a gun that does what you're supposed to be doing really well. Whereas if you're playing as those other classes, you're trying to do a little bit more in line with the veteran sharpshooter, but you're not really synergizing with your class. You're finding maybe that you can't deal with long-range enemies all that well, your team comp is really bad, you've got too many short-range characters with flamethrowers, so you needed something that lets you take out those precise enemy targets from long distance, so you picked this thing. Not the worst choice, not the best choice for that for those other classes, but it is very good at the role for the veteran sharpshooter. So let's take a look at a couple traits and features to this that are not really known about on the information that you can check. If you ever want to know more about a weapon, just go under operative, go into your weapon, and then hit the V button. That will tell you a lot of information about your gun. I'm not going to go over all of this information because you can in fact look it up yourself. Nothing too interesting as far as that goes, but there is, again, some stuff that's not told there. So first of all, this gun actually consumes 3 ammunition every time you fire it. This is for both your reserve as well as from your magazine. As you can see, we fired off 1 bolt that took away 3 of our ammunition. When we reload here, it's going to take away 3 from the reserve size. So the numbers are deceptive there. You think that you've got a huge amount of ammunition both in the magazine and in reserve. The reality is you have quite a lot less. The next one is that this thing has razor-sharp precision when fired down sights, allowing you to very consistently get headshots if you are aiming for those, or if you're just aiming for body shots, you'll get exactly where you're looking for there as well. However, it has incredibly poor hip fire. If we take a look here, firing sort of away, it's not really hitting that easily. It also does not have perfect accuracy on first shot with hip fire. You might get lucky and get a couple shots in the right vicinity, but as you can see here, we're not getting these headshots with this guy, even though the dot's over his head. Still not a headshot. So if you're aiming down the sights, you've got very good accuracy. If you're hip firing, you have very bad accuracy. This crosshair here is the area that this is capable of deflecting off of in a sort of circle that sort of represents. You can see just how bad the aim is on that. Now, another thing that's hidden about this is it does penetrate through 2 of these guys, as in it hits 2 of them. It doesn't actually do this with any other enemy type, however. Take this regular Poxwalker here. As you can see, it doesn't hit both targets. You can only hit 1 target at a time with this gun for the most part. The one exception is these guys over here. Why it is that they decided to make these guys so that you can hit 2 of them at once, not entirely sure, but that is the way it is. I have not been able to get this to go through 3 of them at a time. I don't think it's capable of that. It's also not capable of going through multiples of anything else like these guys here. Even if it hits them in the head, doesn't go through or anything like that, just gets a headshot, stops right there. So the only people that you're going to be penetrating through are these guys here. Now, if you really want to get finicky, you can also go through these guys and hit something else that is not one of them. So the reverse, of course, is not true. So the shot is clearly passing through these guys and dealing full damage out the other side there. So anyway, let's take a look at how this weapon performs in some of the categories that I was talking about there. Alright, so let's talk about this gun's capacity for horde clearing. This is not necessarily the best and it's not necessarily the worst of guns in this capacity. It's got a very large amount of ammunition, even though that 105 number might look impressive. Obviously, it's 1/3 of that. Still, that leaves you with 35 shots. That's plenty for most situations. You're also looking at a very large ammo reserve, so you can afford to just dump shots into hordes if you want to with this gun. There's nothing wrong with that. Where it lacks in terms of its horde clearing ability is the fact that you're going to have to fire very, very rapidly to get rid of those sort of groups. And this gun just doesn't really do that. It doesn't have that kind of rapid fire punch that you want out of something that does a horde clear. There are very few guns that are truly good at hitting many, many targets very, very quickly compared to the melee weapons and sort of mitigating or dealing with hordes in the same way that certain melee weapons, especially the crowd control melee weapons, can. The only ones that I'd say are really comparable at that role are the flamethrowers. So the Kantrael not necessarily being very good at this role isn't a huge mark against it. Not many of the guns are amazing at it, but it is notable that they're not really that fantastic for this role. What they're good at is just throwing out shots against a limited horde where they've clustered around your Ogren or they've clustered around your Zealot, and you've got the ability to sort of fire at them to thin down the horde quicker so that they're going to you're going to move on to other things more quickly. Now, another thing that can go wrong with this gun is that it does sometimes punch a little bit too softly on the harder difficulties. So if you're body-shotting Poxwalkers on the hardest difficulty, you're going to find that this doesn't really have enough punch to down them in one body shot. You're going to have to go for those headshots, which is not really practical for that role. And this isn't a huge deal as far as that goes because not many guns do one-shot those, but when you have to fire 2 shots to down them with a slow-firing weapon, and this isn't a slow-firing weapon, it's a moderately slow-firing weapon, you're looking at a situation where you're spending a lot of time downing one Poxwalker, and that's not really great for that sort of role. Generally speaking, I would say that this is one of the ones where it's only really capable of doing it when you're not necessarily being super threatened yourself. You're going to be using this to help scrape enemies off of your allies. Now, in terms of how well this does against high-priority targets, this is probably one of the best guns in the game. It comes back on center after you've fired it relatively quickly, meaning that you can line up a shot, get a headshot, take out a dreg or something like that with an autogun, and then immediately go to a next target and fire at that one, go to the next one, fire at that one. And you can sort of jump from target to target, or you can just spam shots into a corridor where there's a lot of targets, or you can just sort of hope for the best, firing at a large number of just yellow blobs that you see in the distance. Any of those sort of things are pretty viable with this gun, and it's going to make it so that you can take out those kinds of situations relatively easily with this thing. And it's also very good for picking off specials. If you've got a high priority special that you just need to take down really, really quickly, this is a gun that's very capable of doing that sort of thing. As a result, I actually think that this is one of the best guns in the game, and the entire Kantrael family is probably the best in the game at that sort of role. There are guns that are going to take out those high priority targets in one shot much more consistently than this, but they don't have the sort of ammo capacity or the ability to come back on center, allowing you to take out multiple lesser threats, all in a sort of one clean sweep. Like, for example, the Bolter, as an example, is going to let you one-shot a lot more of the hard-hitting specials, like the Toxflamer, for example, in one headshot, but the optics on the Bolter are a lot worse, making it harder to line up that headshot in the first place. And then once you do that, you have to take forever to get the gun back on center. So if there's 2 threats, you're going to take down the one, and then you're going to have to haul the gun all the way back so that you can fire at the second one, and then so on and so forth. So when you're firing at those sort of dregs with guns or the scabs with Lasguns, you're taking forever to get through them all just because that gun's not very good at that. This gun's much, much better at those situations and is still pretty good at sniping out those specials because you can fire a headshot, come back on center pretty quickly, get another headshot, and so on and so forth. So either of those situations, this is going to do pretty well. I would say that the Kantrael MG12 is better at taking out the specials than this one, and this one's a little bit better at taking out the dregs with guns. So the next category is armor, and unfortunately this gun, like most weapons in this game, is not necessarily that good against armor. Now, I don't hold that too heavily against it, and I would not actually mark it as super low on that sort of field because most guns are not fantastic against armor. but the Kantrael in particular tends to feel like it's very piddly against even flak armored opponents. So you are going to find that there's a lot of situations where you got to aim for body shots because maybe they've got a carapace armored helmet, and in those instances you're going to be going for those body shots and doing virtually no damage compared to what you should be, and enemies are just going to survive a lot more shots than you really want them to be surviving. So this isn't a huge strike against it because it still has enough hitting power just behind it that it's going to still cause a lot of damage to those targets, but they are having your damage. So I would say that this is kind of average at this roll as far as ranged weapons goes. And just as a side note, ranged weapons tend to have worse armor penetration than melee weapons. So our next category is the oh shit button. This is probably the worst series in the game, and this might be the worst gun in this series in this game for acting as an oh shit button. If there's a mutant that's just turned a corner and you need to take it out fast, this is pretty much the worst gun you can have at your disposal. It takes a long time to get the damage to come out of the barrel of this gun. Even though it's going to come out consistently, you're going to have a lot of it in the magazine. It's accurate. Those are not the sort of traits that you're looking for when you're trying to down something that's going to be on top of you in just a moment. You want to be able to dump a huge amount of damage in just a very, very short period of time, and this is not that gun. It is worse, I think, than any gun that I can immediately think of at that particular roll. And honestly, it's not that important a roll when you're looking at what you should be doing with this gun. Hopefully other people are further up front, but sometimes you're leading the back and like a mutant spawns behind you and you have to deal with that really, really quickly. So you're going to have to learn how to dodge if you're using this gun because you can't rely on it to fix you out of those situations. By a similar token, this thing is not that great against bosses. It doesn't dump the damage out of the magazine fast enough to really make it feel like you're doing anything more than tickling that boss, but you can tickle a boss to death with this gun pretty effectively. Again, the magazine is very large, the damage per shot is quite high. You're capable of outputting a fairly large, steady stream of damage using this weapon, which does work against bosses. It's just that there are definitely weapons that dump the damage out onto those, especially if you need to get rid of them very, very quickly. One of the things that you might consider doing when you've got this kind of weapon and a boss spawns is instead of focusing on the boss, you kill everything around the boss so that everyone else has an easier time focusing down the Plague Ogre or the Beast of Nurgle without getting harassed by Lasgun shots or anything else like that. And as long as you're leaving the Beast of Nurgle or the Plague Ogre alone, it will leave you alone for the most part, letting you focus down those other high priority targets and those horde monsters and stuff like that. And then once those are all gone, you can sort of just focus on slowly plinking away at it with your last rifle, and you'll probably be able to rack up an okay amount of damage. Another thing to note is because this damage is low and steady compared to what other people are potentially going to be doing, those bosses tend to aggro onto whoever's doing the most damage to them quickly. So if you're using a Lasgun, it's very unlikely you're going to draw the attention or the ire of those things, letting you really focus on those other sorts of targets there. And that's basically how this thing rates up. I'm going to put up some numbers here. They mean, broadly speaking, very little. They're out of 10. But I would say that as far as horde clearing goes, this gun's maybe a 3 out of 10. As far as the high priority targets, I'd give this probably a 9. I do think there's one gun that is a little bit better than this, but maybe even a 9.5. If we talked about armor, I would say that this is about a 4, which is pretty average for guns. For the oh shit button, I would say that this is a 1. I would say that this is probably the worst gun in the game for that particular role. And against bosses, I would probably put this at about a 4 as well. So this might seem like this is a condemnation of this gun, but you have to remember something very important, and that is that high priority targets is the main role for the veteran sharpshooter, and this is a veteran sharpshooter gun. Other classes can take it. If you're playing as the Psyker, you could theoretically have one, but when you need to engage those targets with that precision fire, you're typically going to see Psykers using their headburst ability. You can take this as a Zealot, but it's going to be a little bit harder to use this as the Zealot. People are reporting that its ability to land accurate shots is slightly impaired when they're playing the Zealot, as in like it sways a little bit more and has worse recoil than the veteran sharpshooter. Have not confirmed this for myself, but I do know that one of your abilities as the veteran sharpshooter can get rid of 60% of the sway that you'd otherwise suffer from when holding this gun, so it makes it much, much more accurate. And generally speaking, the Zealot should not be standing stationary, aimed down sights, trying to line up headshots. That's really not something that's their main role. So typically speaking, this is going to be a veteran sharpshooter gun. Now, with all that being said, let's go over a little bit of the guns and the builds that you can make with it. So, first of all, let's talk about melee weapons. Now, the Kantrael MG1A Infantry Lasgun is a gun that is primarily going to be for taking out those long distance, high priority targets. This is going to leave you a little bit vulnerable from both armored and horde type opponents in melee combat, and you're going to have to know how to sort of deal with both of them. The obvious answer for this is going to be Minotaur Mark III Power Sword, and unfortunately, because of the melee balancing, that's always going to be your best answer pretty much every time with the veteran sharpshooter. It's just by far their strongest melee weapon. And there's a couple of reasons for that. I'll get into those when I talk about the Minotaur Mark III Power Sword in its own video. It's a unique weapon to the veteran sharpshooter. I'm just not going to talk about it because no matter what gun you're using, the Minotaur Mark III Power Sword is the most powerful. If you want something a little bit more interesting, though, that's capable of doing sort of the roles that you need, let's talk about some of the other options that you've got here. So there's a couple different directions you can go. The KDM Mark IV Assault Chainsword is also a very versatile weapon. It's not as strong flat out as the Minotaur Mark III, but it is capable of giving you that well-rounded ability to deal with hordes. It's capable of also dealing with single targets pretty effectively, and it's also very effective against armored opponents. So as a result, it's a pretty good choice if you're going to be going after a melee weapon with the Kantrael, just because it's going to cover your bases against the things that are threatening you in melee. You can sort of just keep pushing things away and smashing them with your sword when they're getting up too close to you, and then you can focus more of your time on your firing. The other option is to go with tactical axes or knives. These are weapons that have fairly high attack speeds, letting you sort of quickly get a large number of headshots. They've got a finesse stat and a critical bonus stat, letting you do a lot of damage on headshots. And if you get a very high finesse one, you can swing this really, really, really quickly. The advantage of that is that it's a little bit more capable of dealing damage against certain high priority targets that you want to be punching down in melee. And it still gives you that flexibility to potentially be getting rid of hordes effectively. The problem is you have to be very, very good to deal with a horde using something like the Aatrox Mark VII Tactical Axe, something that I don't really recommend trying to do. Generally speaking, you're much better off using broad sweep type weapons against them. Same thing with the knife. People can horde clear with the knife quite effectively. I have seen people do that, generally speaking, as the Zealot, because they have some benefits that you don't as the veteran sharpshooter. So I would just say that, use that style of play with the very finesse weapons, only if you're very confident in yourself. The other option would be the Catachan Mark IV Devil Claws sword, or the other types of Devil Claw swords. There's a whole bunch of them. They've got a decent amount of damage to them if you use the heavy attack. They're capable of hitting a wide area, both with light and heavy attacks, making them very good for horde clear. They're not particularly good against armored opponents, though, so you're going to struggle a little bit more against those. If you're finding that your biggest concern is dealing with hordes, then I would say go for the Catachan Mark IV. If your bigger concern is going against armored opponents, I would recommend something like, say, the Rashad Mark II Combat Axe. This thing is extremely good against heavily armored opponents, but it's not necessarily the best against horde type situation. If you have one like mine which has an 80% finesse, that increases its swing speed, and this becomes actually pretty okay for dealing damage against hordes, but I still don't like using this thing when that's my particular sort of concern. So those are the angles you're going to sort of look at this from. You're using a fairly powerful, specifically tuned weapon that isn't very good for either of these situations. I think that the more common situation is going to be you need horde clear, and the heavy weapon attack for even the Catachan Mark IV is going to at least do some armor damage. So if you can clear out all the regular guys with the horde clear abilities and your gun, the fact that you're not that great at armor, hopefully someone else is capable of dealing with that for you. If no one is, I would take something like the Rashad Mark II Combat Axe if they're all focused on horde clear. Now, the same thing sort of goes for the other classes. If you're playing as the Zealot, you've got the option of taking something like the Club. Any of the weapons you're going to take as the Zealot, you're going to focus your build around your melee weapon. The Psyker, I wouldn't necessarily say you're likely to take Kantrael MG1A Infantry Lasgun other than when you start out the game, but if you were to take that, again, the same sort of thing applies. You want weapons that have a fairly wide sweep, which is a little bit harder as the Psyker. Typically speaking, they have dueling weapons. So let's look at the feats here. Now, there's a couple different ways that you can build a Kantrael. For your toughness perk at level 5, you could take Confirmed Kill if you know you're going to be up against a lot of elites. You could take Exhilarating Takedown if you know you're going to be capable of getting a lot of those headshots consistently. I think At Arm's Length is the most consistent one for me. The reason is that if you're capable of clearing space around you and then focusing on your ranged shots, because you've positioned yourself where you can just sort of be in a sniper's nest, or you're most concerned about winning those ranged engagements against dug-in opponents, then At Arm's Length is the most reliable and easy one to activate. It also means that you're recovering toughness when you're sort of on the move from position to position. Now, if you're level 10 feet, you're going to be picking between Sniper and Demolition Stockpile. You rarely need Tactical Reload because you honestly reload quite quickly with the Kantrael MG1A Infantry Lasgun. The Sniper one is going to be the one you take when you find that people are just barely surviving your headshots, especially when you're using volley fire. So when you're out and about with this gun, you're going to sometimes see things spark up orange, and that's going to indicate to you that you got a headshot but did not get a kill. And if it's targets that you really need to be downing quickly, you need to be able to down them faster, and you really wish you had been able to down them in that one shot, then taking Sniper can often boost you just a little tiny bit over that. And you don't need to be one-shotting everything, or you don't need to be two-shotting everything with this gun, or with any gun for that matter. What you're simply thinking about here is, would my life be a lot more convenient if I was downing these opponents in one less shot? And in a lot of instances, that answer is actually going to be yes. This is also going to be dependent on the difficulty you're on. Now, if most of the situations that you're finding you're hitting people, they're going down in the number of shots you want them to, I would recommend taking Demolition Stockpile. I would also take Demolition Stockpile if you're having trouble with hordes. Demolition Stockpile would probably be the better of the two if you're having trouble with hordes, regardless of what you're doing with your damage on headshots or with your volley fire or whatever threshold you're really looking to get through. But that's sort of your choice between in this particular with this particular kind of gun. I often take Sniper just because there's a bunch of targets that I just barely don't kill with my particular Kantrael on the hardest difficulty, which I do kill with Sniper. For the next one, I think Biooptic Targeting or Demolition Team are good. Theoretically, you could also take Covering Fire as long as you had a team that you're sort of organized with. It can be good in those instances. It's a little bit tricky to use sometimes, but Demolition Team is great if you don't have Demolition Stockpile because it lets you get extra grenades, which are very, very powerful. And Biooptic Targeting, I find, just generally speaking, makes it way easier for your group to sort of push through those areas where the enemy's dug in and sort of getting into a long distance firefight against you. For your level 20 perk, Unwavering Focus is fine. This is going to be the one that you're choosing if you are finding yourself in situations where you're firing at the enemy and you just want to stand up straight, fire your gun, and not worry about the damage that you're taking, especially if you've got the ability to replenish toughness faster than they're dealing damage to your toughness. This is really, really powerful in those instances, and it's a pretty good defensive ability here. Duck and Dive is probably not what you're taking with this one, but you could take Camo Expert. This is sort of the opposite end of Unwavering Focus. Unwavering Focus is if you have no way of stopping yourself from being the target for the enemy, because you're going to be the only one that they have available to shoot at. This makes it so that you can sort of just stand there, be on the move, moving from cover to cover, and being with your by yourself in a sort of vantage point, and absorbing all that fire from the enemy. Camo is if you're with the team. You're capable of sitting there nice and stationary, and you're capable of just picking off the enemies while they ignore you. But if there's no allies in sight, what's going to happen is all of those enemies are going to fire at you anyway. And the reason is that even if you have Camo Expert, if you're the only target, then you're priority target. So this one works in some situations, this one works in other situations. I prefer Camo Expert since I prefer trying to stay in areas where they're going to shoot at my team, but that's going to be up to you. The next one is going to either be Fragstorm if you've gone for a heavy grenade build, or if you really need those grenades to do a bit more. This is only going to be on higher difficulties because people will die from one grenade on the lower difficulties, so you don't need the 8 stacks of bleed in the lower difficulties regardless. If you're finding that you are going grenade sort of build there and you really don't want the penalties from Deadshot, or you're not going the grenade build, you're on the lower difficulty, and you're not using Deadshot, I would recommend one after another just so that you've got something. But in most difficulties, I would say it's either going to be Fragstorm if you need the extra damage on grenades, or it's going to be Deadshot. Deadshot makes it so that your gun does a little bit more damage because you're going to be getting more criticals, In fact, quite a bit more criticals. But the more important thing is that you're getting reduced sway, making it much easier to land headshots with this thing. I actually think this is a pretty good feat if you're going for that sort of sniper style to your gameplay there. Now, lastly, I think that counterfire is exactly the sort of thing that you want with this gun. You're going to be going after those dregs with assault guns, you're going to be going after those scabs with lasguns, and this just makes you so much better at dealing with those types of enemies really, really efficiently and really, really quickly. So I do think that counterfire is going to be the one that you're going to pick with this one, pretty much every time. So those are the builds that we've got with the Kantrael MG1A Infantry Lasgun. I think there's some flexibility there. If you really want to, you can make it a very different build, but yeah, I think that this sort of setup works out pretty well here. So in any event, I hope you found this episode enjoyable. I'm going to play you out the rest of the match that we had going there, and I hope to see you guys all next time.
Crate! I see you! Here, catch this! Red shot on her! Runner! You can aim after all! Shotgunner!
This bridge defies at least 7 physical laws.
Watch her learn! Time to reload, veteran! Praise be a healing station! So you need help again, do you?
Soldiers bond. Only thing you can count on.
Scab shot on us!
Lighting targets.
Scab shot on us! Oh, of course they found cover! There's ammo here, zealot! Ammo!
Summon the elevator varlets. Expect resistance.
Heads down! Sniper! Ready back down! That's the hell! Better than average! This is how it's done! Enemy doggy!
thrive down here.
You have to pick a side to survive down here.
And who is there to speak for the common folk?
Getting some payback.
Silo Cluster 1866A lies beyond this marketplace.
Level 3! Magnificent Templar! Seize your work, Templar! Your great strength within me! That's the house, then! Big duty done for! Come on, Greg! Big duty eliminated!
Something good for the collection.
Engaging. Focus. Fire.
Striking armor achieves nothing! Aye! It's down! Enemy! Each other! Burn them out! Stop! Corner! Taking fire!
Sever the head. The body dies.
You should heal, soldier! Look!
Can you believe the state of the Russians they've got us on?
Be thankful for what you have. Corner! You shrek! Corner! Good shot!
Even here, the dead heroes of the past still stand guard.
My journey is close to its end. Crisis 3! Return fire! Quicken on your retreating! It's coming! Chopper coming in! Charging! Christ, it's 7-7 down! Help me! Reaper! Provides the means of death unto his servant.
What is this I see?
Have a care around Brahm's pilgrims. She is dark of Xenos and cannot be trusted. It's not a problem,
The only good sense is one crack. Need to boots for the last glorious armies. Most holy grenade!
My prayers are answered. Holy ammunition.
Ammo! Looting!
Ammo!
Where have the heretics gone? I yearn to chastise them.
You wait.
Engage the autobots. Terminate the Imperial entity. That is simple enough, surely.
Scab shotgunner.
Reloading! Cover me!
Destroy the demonic matter to eliminate contagion.
Stay that thing!
Dying on it? Not now.
Stop the rotter!
Metaphysical contagion in retreat. Continue.
Grenade out!
Grab some of that ammo, soldier! Grenade out!
Alpha new demonic matter must be eliminated.
Barrel's going! Get down to there! Anxious pain kills. So it helps. Throwing grenade!
Oh, that's what I was looking for.
Last hit 220 engaged! Come on, priest! Heal up!
Almost there!
Right now, how many did you get?
Praise the Master!
No need for fancy shots!